These two committees in the House and the Senate, how important are these investigations going to be? And will that be the official word on what happened?
They are important. Thanks for having me on. They are important, and they will get to the bottom of it. I'm confident. And that will be the official word unless, the Secretary of Defense suddenly comes out and throws everything out into the public.
Mm-hmm. Does this conversation worry you when you hear senators using the term war crimes?
I think it's the tip of the iceberg, really, because there's been concern about the Venezuela operation from the beginning. First of all, it represents, at this time, a distraction from what's going on with Ukraine, where Ukraine is fighting for what Americans believe we have. The majority of the American people want to support Ukraine, and this seems to be a distraction to enable the rug to be pulled out from under Ukraine in what was a 28-point peace plan. Now, that may not be going forward, but that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, what's the objective in Venezuela? Why are we going against Maduro? Sure, maybe we don't like him, but are you going to put 25% of the U.S. Navy down there indefinitely? What's the point? What's the objective? What's the strategy? And what about the rest of our global responsibilities? That's the second thing. And then there's the business of striking these boats. And then there's, and this is like the cherry on top, that's the allegation that maybe there was a war crime committed here on the order of the Secretary of Defense. So there's a lot to unpack here at this time, to be honest with you.
Wow. Well, that's why we're glad to have you with us. If this, in fact, turned out to be true, as was described by the report, the first strike, 2 men survive. We went back and hit them again without taking them captive, without boarding the vessel, without trying to investigate where they were from. And maybe they had imagery of these men getting on that boat. Even with that said, would that equal a war crime?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so these things are always under law. But all of us in the armed forces were told there are obvious crimes that you don't do. No matter who says to do it, you don't shoot a prisoner. You don't kill unarmed civilians. And so these people were basically no threat to the United States. Their mission was finished with the destruction of the boat. So they sort of fall in the category of people who were no threat, and they shouldn't have been killed. Yeah, it looks like a war crime, prima facie.
Wow. General Alvin Halsey, the admiral, who is retiring as the head of U.S. Southern Command, may well be called to testify before these committees. How important would that be, knowing that he can't play with the truth on this? And he was, of course, at odds with Hegseth over the operation. That's why he's stepping down. Will Admiral Halsey be the key to this case?
Not necessarily. We don't know where the reports came from. And looks like it was under the SOCOM rather than SOUTHCOM. So it might be the Special Operations Command commander who has to testify. Now, what we don't know is why Admiral Halsey was unhappy and why he's stepping down early. So maybe he'll be a peripheral witness in this. But it doesn't sound like he was under the chain of command. Maybe he was uncomfortable with the whole operation, or maybe they just had it out for him for some reason. There had been over 20 general and flag officers fired by this or forced to resign by this administration. And there's never really been an explanation for most of it. It is unusual. Normally it's not done. And it does worry people in Congress that the military is being politicized. The whole idea of the United States Armed Forces, like the civil service, is you work for whoever the people elect. You're not partisan. And that's been a really important principle in the U.S. Armed Forces.
What did you make of President Trump's post over the weekend addressed to airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers? He said, please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. Does the United States have the right to close Venezuelan airspace, General? How would that work?
I don't know, but if I were a pilot, I would stay out of Venezuelan airspace. And I would imagine the international civil aviation authorities are coming back to the United States, and there's discussion about this right now.
Boy. Well, we know that we've got quite the armada set up in that area, General. We've talked about that. It remains, including the Jerry Ford carrier strike group. President Trump said on Air Force One last evening that he had a phone call with Nicolas Maduro, the very leader here we're considering replacing in a regime change operation. If you put your diplomat hat on, what do you make of these dual tracks that the administration is taking?
Well, I think it should be dual tracked. You know, before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we were trying to persuade Saddam Hussein to leave. Apparently, we had offered him $2 billion if he'd just get out of town. And we were told, basically, he was afraid that even if he took the money, he'd never live to use it because someone would knock him off. So he elected to stay and tough it out. I don't know whether President Trump offered Maduro any money or not. But the desirable way to settle this at this point is for Maduro to leave. And that's the signal that he's been given. Now, is it wise U.S. policy? Is it the right strategy? Is this where our national priorities are? Those are different matters. But just in terms of the operation, the easiest resolution, the cleanest resolution, is for President Trump to say, look, I got a bunch of stuff out here. A lot of bad things could happen. You don't want that to happen, especially to you personally. Here's a little bit of money. Go somewhere else. But apparently funds weren't offered. And Maduro has said no. Maybe there's going to be a second phone call at some point.
Boy, this is day to day, hour to hour. General, we know that the president will be meeting around 5 p.m., according to reports, with his war commanders to talk about next steps and what happened with regard to these drug boats, alleged drug boats. And of course, we'll let everyone know as soon as we learn more on this. But I have to ask you about what's taking place in Ukraine now that we see Steve Witkoff pack his bags for another visit to Moscow. There was quite a read in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, General. Make money, not war, was the headline, to suggest that Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and others are motivated by resuming economic ties and investment opportunities in Russia when it comes to the idea of ending the war in Ukraine. Is that a dangerous approach or one that will actually bring peace?
I think it's unlikely to bring peace in these circumstances. Because Russia is it's a very difficult country to deal with. It's not a normal country. And, Putin is prepared to say and do whatever's necessary to get what he wants. He wants Ukraine. He wants all of Ukraine. He wants the Baltic states back under Russian control. And he wants NATO basically to be disassembled, at least as far as it is in Eastern Europe. And of course, he'd like the United States to get out of Europe. So there's a lot more riding on this than financial transactions. On the other hand, if the world runs on finance, there's no doubt about it. And Russia does have certain commodities that could be put on the market if sanctions were lifted. So, but these men should be negotiating on what's in U.S. national interest overall, not in narrow financial terms